Hello, and welcome to another video in my Homebrew campaign creation series. In the previous videos, we both created our map, and we focused on a region as well as a settlement that is going to serve as the setting and backdrop for our first arc. That first arc is what we're going to be focusing on not only in this video, but in the video after it. Today, we're just going to work on the skeleton of the arc, as well as talking about what the key components of the arc are going to be. In the next video, we're going to flesh out the details and add more depth to that arc, as well as work on things like the story beats and that sort of thing. Today, it's going to be a little more simple and more of just creating the outline and also understanding what is necessary to make a successful first arc of a campaign. Before we dive in any further, I just want to take time to thank you for watching this video, checking it out, and for supporting me in any way you can. Liking, commenting, subscribing, whatever you want to do, anything helps me at this stage. So thank you very much. So let's dive in and get started on creating the skeleton of our first arc. Skeleton is just what I'm referring to it as because these are the bones of the arc that we're going to build the whole body of it around. To create our arc's skeleton, there are a few core components that we need to make sure that the arc has. I'm sure you've experienced stories in your lifetime that are a bit clunky right at the start, especially if they're a series. Usually you have things like world building and character introductions all right at the forefront of a series. This can be a bit heavy-handed, and we want to make sure that we're avoiding that heavy-handedness and kind of exhausting storytelling practice here in the first arc of our campaign. In the first arc of a campaign, much like the first arc of any story, you have a lot to do. You need to introduce the world, the NPCs, and the player characters all in one, as well as establish all sorts of rules and have a good story in the midst of all of that. The first arc is a lot of work. You have a big task on your hands, and we want to make sure that we're tackling it in the most appropriate and expedient way possible without inundating our players with a bunch of knowledge that is just going to exhaust them, wear them down, and make them feel like this is a campaign where all they're going to do is take notes rather than play a game. As I've said in the past, you should be taking notes, and if your players are not taking notes, that's unwise. But you don't want that to be the only thing you're doing where you have to write down a note every time the DM says something, because everything that the DM is saying to you is an info dump of important information. So, what are the core components that we need to make our first arc successful and give the players the information that they need without overwhelming them and flooding their brains with all of this knowledge? The first component is bringing the party together. This is one of the key components and probably the first thing that is going to happen in your story arc. Bringing the party together is essentially just introducing each of the player characters to one another. There are tons of ways that you can go about this. The most common one is to just have everybody meet up in a tavern, or to just have them already know each other in some degree or fashion. Everyone meets in a tavern is kind of a common trope, especially for tabletop role-playing games and especially for Dungeons & Dragons. Everybody just meets in a tavern, they just happen to run into each other, and they form a party somehow. It's not really necessary how, it's not important, and you can kind of just leave it up to your imagination because we have a story we want to get to, and you don't want to sit here doing introductions the entire time. Everyone meets in a tavern is a trope that really falls apart when you look at it for any length of time or with any amount of scrutiny. And some people are fine with this and they just say, use your imagination. We're going to skip over the meeting portion and just get right to it, which is fine if you just want to dive in and play the game. But for me, I like to make sure that everything is well established and has a solid foundation right from the beginning. I want my party to have a reason to spend time together, be friends, go on adventures. And that's not going to happen if they just all happen to meet in a tavern and there is nothing that could really unify them apart from the campaign that I happen to write that I want them all thrust into. So, what are some other methods that we can go about getting the party together that don't involve the meeting in a tavern trope, and that when you look at them with scrutiny and with a detailed-oriented eye, you don't notice everything falling apart and you don't see a bunch of cracks in the foundation upon which your party is built? One of the ways that you can bring the party together and make them cohesive and wanting to work together is giving every party member a common goal. Make them all want to accomplish the exact same thing before they even meet. In fact, wanting to accomplish that common goal could be the reason why they meet. They all meet together because there's a goal they want to accomplish, and if they work together, they can get it done. Then have that goal cover the first 1 or 2 arcs. That way, by the time the party has accomplished that common goal, they'll have a reason to have bonded together and want to spend more time with one another. Their friendships will make sense and the party will be cohesive, and Their togetherness is going to be sensible, and when you look at it, you'll be able to say, yeah, they bonded together because they had a common goal, they accomplished it, and then through accomplishing that goal, they found that the real treasure was the friends they made along the way. This is a really good way to get them all together, and nothing's saying they can't meet in a tavern with a common goal, but everybody just happens to run into each other in a tavern and happens to have the same goal in mind doesn't really make as much sense, as everybody has a common goal. They found like-minded individuals and they told them all, we're all going to meet at this tavern so we can discuss this goal that we have. This way, everything has a purpose right from the start before you even sit down at the table at the beginning. This is something I would tell the players in the handout that I give to them. There's actually an upcoming session where we're going to discuss copy that we give to our players, and I would put this common goal in that copy. I would say your party member has to want to accomplish X goal. You can come up with your own reasons why that person wants to accomplish the goal, but it has to be this particular goal because everyone needs to be allied toward this cause. They don't have to be allied toward it for the same reasons. You can have your own reasons why you want to accomplish this, but everyone has to want to get this done in order for the party to be brought together. Another way to do it is just historical companions. These people have always known each other. They've always been a party, whether they just grew up together and they started adventuring, or maybe they have a couple of quests already under their belt and now we're just going on to another one. This skips the need to have everybody meet, but it also removes the ability for the players to get to experience meeting the other characters. This also means the relationships don't grow as dynamically as they would if you were to play this out in real time. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do this and have great relationships, but those relationships might not be as established as you thought they were. Remember, the players haven't played these characters before, most likely, so they might not fully understand each of their personalities, and as a result, if you have the historical companion route, they might write out histories and relationships between the characters that ultimately don't end up being exactly what it was that they wanted, and it ends up limiting them and they have to retcon some of these relationships. There's nothing wrong with that, but historical companions definitely has some advantages and some disadvantages that you'll need to consider. Next is the railroad. The railroad is not one that I would necessarily advise, but it can be used for your first arc. And in fact, in my previous campaign, I used the railroad in order to make my party form. It was essentially forcing the party to accomplish a goal whether they wanted to or not. They had to work together to get this done. And you kind of rely on the hope that by the time they've accomplished the goal, they still want to spend time together. Railroading is essentially saying that the party has limitations in the decisions that they can make regarding a particular goal or quest. You are forcing them in a particular direction. This is generally what you see in things like one-shots, so I don't recommend it for an entire arc where there are 5 or 6 sessions where the party has to go in the direction that the Dungeon Master wants, and they have to work together because the Dungeon Master is forcing them to. It removes a lot of the choice that makes tabletop role-playing games fun, but it can be done in a way that is not so forced or heavy-handed. For example, in the campaign before this one, I railroaded the players on the first arc. I had them in a city that was locked down, and they all had goals they wanted to accomplish both in the city and without the city, but they weren't able to accomplish these goals because the people they needed to talk to and work with couldn't get the resources they needed beyond the city as long as it was locked down. So the party had to work together to remove the threat that had caused the city to become locked down. This was very railroady. I really controlled the directions that they were able to go for the first 4 or 5 sessions. Now, I was a new Dungeon Master. I'd run a couple of sessions before this one, but this probably wasn't the wisest way to bring the whole party together. And it was a fun arc and it established a lot, and I think I did most of it well, but if I could go back, I probably wouldn't make this the first arc because it wasn't a great way to open a campaign. That isn't to say that you can't do it and do it well, but I would personally not recommend railroading the players for the first arc. I think you can railroad them for another arc later on when they're already established, and even then I would limit how much you're railroading them. I wouldn't mind doing another Everybody's Trapped in the City arc and have like a bottle episode for 1 or 2 sessions, but I wouldn't do it for an opening of a campaign ever again. The next component of the arc should be a little bit obvious. It is the plot hook. Plot hooks are a great way to just have everybody interested, catch their attention, and make them want to know more about it and get them excited about what's to come for this particular arc. I actually have a couple of examples that I'm going to share. Feel free to copy them outright, get inspired by them, whatever you want to do. The first one I want to share is Copycat Mead, a well-known established tavern begins to serve a new mead that everyone loves, is a big hit, and is breaking in all sorts of profit for the tavern. However, the owner of a smaller and less well-known tavern claims that this recipe that they're using for the mead that is so popular is his family's recipe that has been stolen from him. At first, everyone just waves a hand dismissively, claiming that he's jealous, until he turns up dead. Another plot hook is street rats. You find a city where there is no one living on the streets. Everyone has exactly what they need. No need goes unmet. However, a local tells the party that she believes the false utopia was achieved and is maintained through sinister means. Or the break-in. A high-profile politician in the city has his house broken into. Nothing is stolen though, except for one item that he believes only has sentimental value. Lastly, the unusual mist. There have been reports of a bizarre, almost pink-colored mist in the forest at night. This has been dismissed as rumors and tales. That is, until a lumberjack discovers a body in the forest that has been completely drained of its blood. Those are just a few plot hooks that I came up with off the top of my head that might be interesting. You can probably come up with ones that are way better or get inspired by those that I suggested. This is just the general approach that you should take to the plot hook. Make it enticing, just a couple of sentences, something short, sweet, and punchy. The third component for the skeleton of the first arc is world establishment. This is how you're going to build the world up for the players and help set the stage for the things that are to come. While the entire world is not going to be the setting for this first arc and your overall arc, eventually the players are going to leave the nest and start exploring. They're going to need something to spur them forward. They're going to need things to be excited about, and they're going to really like it when you foreshadow the things to come, even in the first arc. For example, that first arc that I mentioned where I kind of railroaded the players and the city was locked down, the individual who caused the city to become locked down actually had the big bad as his patron. He was incredibly powerful because of the powers that had been infused into him by the ultimate big bad of the campaign. Over time, and including in that first arc, I started laying clues about who the big bad was, and halfway through the arc they finally met him and saw him and realized how out of their depth they were when they came face to face with him. So make sure that you are establishing key components of your world right from the beginning. Have some NPCs drop a little bit of information here and there. Maybe the players overhear a conversation that gives them just a little bit of lore from your world so they can write a quick note, and then later on, several weeks, several months, or even a couple of years from now, that information is going to pay off and they'll know you were thinking about it right before the first session even began. The last component that I want to mention for the skeleton is character development opportunities. Now, this isn't just helping your players develop personalities for their characters, it's also helping them develop their strengths and weaknesses. Your players are going to need to figure out what the characters are about, what they're good at and what they're bad at. It's not just going to be based on the bonuses, it's going to be partly just based on playing around and figuring out what the strengths and weaknesses of the group are. One particular player may be really good at athletics checks, while another is really good at acrobatics checks. And even though they both might have some similar stats, one of them just ends up being the acrobat of the group. And this really helps establish each player's role within the party. You want to make sure that you have lots of opportunities for this to happen. Usually, when I'm drafting an arc, I make a checklist of every kind of check that I want to make sure I have within that campaign. Now, this is Dungeons & Dragons specific. Some tabletop systems may not allow for this, but I find it really easy to just say, okay, I want 4 different saves during this arc, and I want to make sure I'm going through and at least requiring 1 check from each possible skill, or at least creating a scenario where that skill could potentially be used. Then I'll also just sprinkle in a ton of other kinds of skill checks and opportunities, and I'll improvise, that sort of thing, but I make sure that there are beats I want to hit so that players don't feel like they made a poor choice when it came to which skills they invested in and which ones they didn't. I want to make sure everything matters, especially in the first arc. When a player develops the character, I'll take a look at the character and I'll see, okay, this is the character's strengths. This is what the character wants to do and wants to be. I'm going to make sure that I have some opportunities within this first arc for this character to shine. And I'll do that for each of the characters that my players have. That way there's an opportunity for each of them to be the hero, or for each of them to fail incredibly, which is just as awesome when you're telling a cooperative story. Now you know what the core components of a first arc are. These are things that you really need to hit and make sure that are present in your first arc. At this stage, we're going to go ahead and write a synopsis of the first arc of our campaign. Along the way, we'll take notes about how each of these story beats is going to hit one or all of the components of the arc. For example, we might say, in this scene, I'm going to world build by doing X, or in this scene, I'm going to help with character development for Billy's player by doing Y. We want to make sure that we're noting right from the beginning how we're hitting these core components throughout the arc. For my plot of the first arc set in Kesset, you may remember that I created a town called Kesset in the previous video. This town is divided by a river. Those who live on the island, or the Eight, which is a small island in a river, fun fact, the people who live on the Eight are the wealthy. The Eight is very fine, beautiful, gorgeous, just a wonderful place to live. While the mainland, while not a horrible place to live, is kind of dirty, grimy, and generally reserved for the people that are deemed lower class within Kesset. There's no established government in Kesset, but the merchants who run the entire town do collect fees from the harbor specifically, but also from the farming and everything else that goes on in the town. It is a tax, but they just don't call it that. So, to start the plot of my first arc, the king has come to Kesset to collect what he believes are taxes owed to him. The merchants of Kesset, however, don't have any money for him. It turns out that they have spent all of it, and the entire town of Kesset is bankrupt. So, because there is no coin in Kesset, and because the town is essentially broke, the king is now garnishing wages by taking food out of the mouths of the people. Whatever is produced, he's taking almost all of it for his city. This already produces a lot of interesting conflict and moral ambiguity. There are tons of opportunities for interesting roleplay between the characters, and ways to show how they ally themselves and where they align. We have 3 key players now. We have the king and his people who are taking the food. We have the merchants of Kesset who lied to the townspeople, made the town go bankrupt, and are not really accepting much of the blame for that. They even kind of wave it off and act like this isn't going to be a huge deal and they'll figure it out. Most importantly, we have the poor people of Kesset on the mainland who are going to starve at first. It is not going to be the wealthy people on the Eight who suddenly are out of food and are going to die. They probably have food stores and they have ways to get food brought to them. They can sell some of their goods if they're willing to make that sacrifice, which many of them will not be. We have these 3 key groups that are going to be at play for this first arc, and our players can ally themselves with any of them or none of them. There are many angles that this first arc could take. And this problem within Kesset, the fact that they are going to starve and they are bankrupt, this is what I want the players to solve for the people of Kesset. So we have a very complex problem that's going to involve not just a bunch of combat, but a lot of role-playing and focus, deliberation, probably some meetings. I'm really excited to see how they would run with something like this. There will probably be a lot of sessions where they're just all sitting there talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do, while I get to sit in the DM chair and smile behind the screen because I know things that they don't, which is one of my favorite things. You'll remember that I mentioned a common goal as a possible way to bring the party together. That's going to be what I'm doing here. The party has a common goal of bringing peace and prosperity back to Kesset. The problem is how they're going to go about doing that. There are going to be tons of ways that they can get this done. They can get it done however they want, and I guarantee you they are all going to have slightly different ideas, or probably drastically different ideas based on the characters and their alignments. But how am I going to get them all together? How am I going to get them to work with one another? How will I introduce them? I do not want them to just meet in a tavern. Even if I do start it off with a common goal, I want to make it a little more interesting than that. So my idea here is to split the party into 2 groups. This is something I did for my current campaign and I loved it. It made a lot of really interesting conflicts between them in the first arc. It was really awesome and I look forward to doing it again, and I'll probably do it for all of my future campaigns as well. So I divided them into 2 groups, and I'm going to do that here. I'll have Group A and I'll have Group B. They'll work together to create their characters from start to finish. They'll also establish what their politics are, how they feel peace should be brought together, and this will essentially be a discussion that they all have that I'm not even really present for. They're going to come up with their own plan for bringing peace to Kesset. They're going to create their own characters who are on a particular side of this issue. So they'll develop their characters around how their characters would go about bringing peace back to Kesset, how they would go about solving this problem within Kesset. So 2 groups that do not communicate with one another, creating characters separately that each have different ideas about how peace can be brought back to Kesset. Now I need to put these 2 groups together. In order to do that, I'm going to have one of the groups call a meeting and request that they meet with the other group. And that first group that has the house where everyone is going to be meeting has seen the efforts of the second group, seen that they're trying to keep the peace and solve this problem even though no one really asked them to. They know that they're passionate about it, and they think, maybe we can put all of our heads together and come up with a real solution and work together to get it accomplished and fix this problem in our town. But as I mentioned, they came up with their solutions separately, and I'll probably give them both slightly different information so that I can make sure that the solutions they come up with are different enough to cause a discussion, possibly even a debate at the table right from the first session. My goal is to make it a little bit heated so that these characters have a conflict with each other right from the beginning. And this is probably going to be just the first session, them hashing it out, figuring out what to do and how to go about this, trying to settle their differences, find common ground, and then go out and try to establish peace in Kesset. Now, how am I going to do world building with this? We have Kesset, and it's going to be the main focus of this entire arc. Several sessions will take place just in Kesset, most likely. Well, the world building is actually going to be about the castle town and its king. The king who has come and taken food out of the mouths of the peasants of Kesset. The main villain I'm setting up isn't actually the leaders of Kesset, it is going to be the king himself. Even though he's not going to be the main villain of this arc, or at least I'm not setting him up to be, he is going to be the main villain going forward. And as time goes on through this arc, I'm going to start weaving in some components about the king and about the evil things he's actually doing, how bad things are for the castle town and for all of the towns and cities over which he presides. Things are going to start getting worse and worse throughout the arc, and by the end of it, I'd like for the players to have a pretty good idea that there are some really negative feelings toward the king, and there are some suspicions among the people that he is misleading this entire kingdom. He's stealing things, and he probably would have come and taken food from them anyway, he just used the missing taxes as an excuse to do so. By establishing this right from the start, I make sure the players know right from the beginning that at higher levels, they're probably going to have to do something about this king and his treachery. If they want to, they can just let him run rampant and continue to steal food, or they can try to do something about it and figure out what's actually going on here. I'll also probably have some traders from other settlements nearby in the port who are being overladen with fees now that have risen as a result of the leaders of Kesset trying to get the money back so they can pay the back taxes that they owe to the king. These other traders will add some insight into the other settlements that the players could visit in the future. Next is arc challenges, or character development and moments for each character to shine. This is a little bit hard to come up with before you have each of the character handouts, but you should at least try to come up with a skill challenge for each of the skills once in the arc. I also want to make sure that I have at least a couple of combat opportunities, even though this first arc doesn't sound like it would be very combat heavy. My thoughts for this are things like breaking up fights in the streets between some guards and peasants who are battling it out, trying to make sure that there's no bloodshed. Again, the goal of the group needs to be maintaining peace. Some of them might have a very violent way of going about that, but the idea is to set up situations where they don't have to kill people. They can just try to break up the fight, maybe knock people out who are really going at it, but not kill them. If the party goes against the aristocrats will probably hire some assassins to go after them. They'll get their home broken into and the assassins will come in and try to kill them, and that's a really tense combat situation for a bunch of level 1, maybe level 2 players. Even though this is largely going to be role-playing focused, so there will be a lot of charisma-based checks, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for other checks. And additionally, this particular arc is very charisma focused, but the following arcs after that might be more focused on athletic or acrobatic challenges. Again, I want to make sure I have at least one of each so I can give each player an opportunity to really shine and show off what they can do, and I also want to highlight some of the weaknesses of the group. Then I can figure out which player really had their day with this arc, and I can design the next ones to give some other players the limelight. These are the things you need to think about and write down. Write down what some possible challenges are, get your plot synopsis ready, figure out what kind of world building you want to do and how you want to set up the overall arc of your campaign. Not just this first arc, but the entire campaign and how it's going to go. Once you have that figured out, you can start adding notes. Now, we're going to look at the overall campaign arc in the future. That's a much later video, so you might need to revisit this later on. But you should take notes now about things you want to make sure you're establishing right from the beginning. Maybe you already have plans for some big vile dragon in the north and you want to start dropping some hints about that with the townsfolk in your arc. Make notes about that here. Write down, I need to make sure that townsperson A says X. I need to make sure townsperson B says Y. Make sure that it's overheard by the players or have them drop the information by doing this or that. Give your players the essential information they're going to need later, but really focus in on this arc. By now, you probably understand why I've called this the skeleton of an arc. I can't really sit down and start playing with this arc just as I have it right now, but I have a really solid foundation for which to build the arc up. That's what we're going to do in the next video. When we get to the next video that's coming out next Monday, we're going to start fleshing out and outlining our arc. We're going to go beat by beat, and I'll start showing you how I lay out my arcs and what my documentation tends to look like when I'm creating each session. I have the arc, and then within that arc, I have sessions that I kind of break down, and then within each session, I have beats, and I go through those day by day. Each time we have a session, I try to get through a certain number of beats, or I try to get to particular beats of the story. We're going to break all of that down in the next session, so I fully expect it to be a very thorough, in-depth, kind of challenging session of this series. Go ahead and finish drafting the skeleton of your arc. Sit down, make sure you write down how you're going to hit each of the components, what you plan to do for all of them, and definitely get your plot synopsis ready, because you're going to need that when we start building out the arc in the next session. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. I really appreciate it. I hope it was informative. I hope you have a solid foundation for your story arc. Can't wait to show off the mess that is my Dungeon Master document. I look forward to showing you what my arcs tend to look like right from the beginning, before my players come in and turn everything on its head, which is going to happen. Your players are not going to play your arc beat by beat. They are individuals with their own minds and their own ideas, and they are not in the confines of a video game, and they can use their imaginations in ways that you did not prepare for. So I'm going to show you what I do to write out my arc, and also how I write it so that if my players do turn everything on its heads, I'm prepared for it and can make it look like I was ready for what they just did. Next session, we're going to start fleshing out this arc and building up off of that foundation. By the end of the next session, you'll have a pretty solid first arc ready to go. There will probably still be a couple of details that need to be added, but we're going to get to those a little bit later on. Goal for next session is to make you confident about the arc at hand so that you can just add a couple of minute details here and there in later sessions. Until that session, I am absolutely grateful for any support that you can give me, whether it's a like or a subscription or a comment. I'd love to hear about the plot hook that you've come up with, or maybe just put a random plot hook idea in case somebody else wants to latch onto it and run with it. I'd love to hear what you come up with. Until the next video, bye.